Do you know why a flood map changes? Are you up to date on the newly mapped procedures? If you want to learn more about these topics, this presentation is for you. We'll begin our presentation by looking at how flood maps are created and why those flood maps change. Once we understand the how and why flood maps begin and change, that will then lead us into more information about the newly mapped procedures. Flood maps have multiple uses in a community. Not only are the maps used when joining the flood program, a community will also use these maps to determine flood hazard and assess the flood risks. In the National Flood Insurance Program, a community can be a city, county, village, or even a borough. Simply put, a community is a group of people in an area that chooses to submit an application to participate in the flood program. Once the community has determined the flood risk, they're better able to set effective building codes for proper flood mitigation. Each flood insurance rate map goes through a specific life cycle. The first step is for the community to initiate the application to join the flood program. Once this application is initiated, the community is placed in the initial phase of the flood program, which is called the emergency program. Once the application is initiated, FEMA will send out the Corps of Engineers to begin an in-depth study into that community. Once that study has been completed, the engineers will then do a preliminary flood map that outlines some specific areas of concern. Next, the engineers will give all the information that they've collected to the community officials to look over, publish. The community will also give suggestions to FEMA or corrections. FEMA will then take all of that information and publish a very detailed flood map called the Flood Insurance Rate Map, or the FIRM. The date that this map is approved and ratified is the same date that the community becomes fully approved in the flood program and is moved into the regular program. In the previous slides, I mentioned the two different types of flood maps. The introductory flood map is called the Flood Hazard Boundary Map and is the initial map of the flood program entrance. The final detailed flood map is called the FIRM, or the Flood Insurance Rate Map. The Flood Hazard Boundary Map is not detailed and it's based off of approximate data. This map sets aside areas of concern that are thought to be at a higher risk of flooding. These areas that are set aside will get further study. The Flood Insurance Rate Map, on the other hand, is a very detailed map. The high-risk areas are set aside, as well as the low-risk areas. Just because a flood insurance rate map is ratified doesn't mean that factors can't change that map. The flood insurance rate map designates areas of flood risk. However, flood risk is not static and it can change. Just a few of the factors that can change a flood map are listed on our slide. Aging infrastructure, new community development, natural changes to topography. More historic data and new technology are just a few of these factors. A few years ago, Congress realized that the flood insurance rate maps were out of date and needed to be redone. That initiative was called the Map Modernization Initiative. This program started the process of updating all of the flood maps across the country, which continues to this day. Just one of the goals Congress had in updating flood maps is to ensure that communities take factors such as erosion, land development, and intensified weather patterns into consideration, and the floodplain management process continues. Another goal was to ensure that the rates being charged for a flood policy is accurately proportional to the risk of that area. This joint effort not only allows FEMA to properly establish rates, but it gives a community a better understanding of the flood risk so that appropriate mitigation measures are put in place. Changing a flood insurance rate map is not entered into lightly, and it is a lengthy process that can take anywhere from 3 to 7 years. FEMA does look to the community to be involved in the process and will not proceed without community participation. Before any flood maps can be officially ratified, there is a 90 days appeal process in which the community is expected to not only publish information to the community, but to collect comments and appeals. If the submitted information from the community is found to be more accurate, FEMA will revise the preliminary flood insurance rate map to incorporate the findings. Now that we have a better understanding of how the flood map is created and why maps continue to change, how do these changes affect the flood insurance policy? The National Flood Insurance Program created specific procedures to address areas that have been remapped and are moving from a lower risk non-special flood hazard area into the higher risk special flood hazard area. That means that a property that was once in a B, C, and X flood zone is now in a flood zone beginning with the letter A or V on the flood insurance rate map. Moving from a non-special flood hazard area into a special flood hazard area does mean higher premiums for the policyholder. The newly mapped procedures were put in place by the NFIP in order to gradually give the policyholder time to transition into higher premiums. In order to be eligible for these procedures, the property must be newly mapped into a higher risk special flood hazard area. The applicant also has 12 months from the map revision date to put a flood insurance policy in place. If the flood policy is not put in place within that 12-month period, then that policy will be written using the higher risk flood zone. There are a few scenarios that are ineligible for the newly mapped procedures. Buildings and/or contents that are still in the emergency program. Multi-unit residential condominium buildings that are eligible under the Residential Condominium Building Association policy. Buildings that are on leased federal property determined to be located on the river-facing side of any dike, levee, or other riverine flood control structure, or seaward of any seawall or other coastal flood control structures. Finally, buildings that do not meet the loss history criteria within a 10-year period, regardless of any change in ownership of a structure, will also be ineligible for the newly mapped procedures. Here is what agents need to know about the newly mapped procedures. Once the property is remapped into the special flood hazard area, the policyholder must obtain flood insurance coverage within 12 months from the map revision date in order to qualify for the newly mapped procedures. If this is completed, the policyholder will receive 1 year at a preferred risk policy rate, then gradually will have increased rates until such time as the application of the elevation certificate reduces the premium, or if eligible, the grandfathered rate is more economical. Another common occurrence when a flood map changes is the lender will often require flood coverage after a map change. The lender has 24 months from the map revision date to notify the policyholder of the map change and the requirement for the flood insurance policy. The policyholder then has 45 days from the initial lender notification to obtain coverage and to qualify for the newly mapped procedures. If you would like to know more information about the flood program, check out the ebooks found on www.nationalfloodservices.com. Another helpful website is www.agents.floodsmart.gov. Thank you for joining me as we take a look at flood maps and the newly mapped procedures. We hope to see you again on another presentation.